Ladies and gentlemen, hopefully bringing things online here, just making sure everything is working okay. Gonna wait a few minutes here before we get started, but today I'm playing around with the preliminary dive into the recent Solarwinds hack. I've had a couple people in my circle ask me about what is it, what does it mean, why is it important, do I give a shit? And those are all interesting questions, and they all have a variety of different answers depending on, how much you actually give a shit about IT security and the security of the internet in general. But anyway, so what we're going to talk a little bit about is what the SolarWinds hack was, the profile of the attack. We're going to talk a little bit about. Just give me 1 second here while I get stuff together. Done. Love it. All right. So. Okay, so the first thing we're going to get started here is, I think you guys can see my screen, hopefully. It doesn't look like that's working. Well, it should be working. Okay, so first off, what is SolarWinds? Who are they as a company? And I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm doing a little bit of writing as I talk because I'm going to work on actually a little bit of a more polished video on this subject. But who is SolarWinds? So SolarWinds is essentially an IT company that provides a lot of different products, particularly around network infrastructure management. So their applications essentially sit on servers inside of your network, and they monitor things like, let's say, the speed of the network, the number of IP addresses that you have. You can manage things like access points, locations. You can visualize your network in all kinds of interesting ways that give you insight into your business. So they have a variety of different network management applications that sit on pretty much every Fortune 500 company's systems. If you work for any large organization with a large IT infrastructure, most of them are going to have SolarWinds, if not like a comparable product. So what does SolarWinds actually do? It helps IT professionals manage stuff on the network. So whether it's managing the capacity of how many IP addresses that they have to hand out, or whether it's another example would be managing, like I said, having to visualize where all the nodes on your network so you could see, okay, this office is down or this office is down. Now, not the problem, but one of the properties of having network management software like SolarWinds, Orion, and their different products is it sits on a particularly sensitive part of the network. So you are talking about, installing things that have access to like really critical infrastructure. It's like building things near your spine or your brain. It's like, okay, this is like important, close to some important systems. So as a result, it has access to those critical systems. And so, if I was a hacker or if someone was trying to penetrate a system, a lot of the time you want to get into stuff that, one way that hackers get into systems essentially is through finding some kind of external, I was able to log into someone's email. I was able to get to some, web portal or something. And through there, they'll meander their way through into the network or into the system that they're looking for. It's a lot better if you as a hacker can get access to like an infrastructure server, a management server, right? So one of the challenges, though, to doing that is, a lot of servers are protected by things like two-factor authentication, geo-locking, IP locking. There's a lot of stuff that good IT professionals do to keep people out of their network. Now, here's where things get a little bit interesting. So what actually happened to SolarWinds? So you have all of these huge companies, these Fortune 500 companies, telecommunications companies, running the software on their networks. And apparently some Russians, and we're going to get into like the DLL file and how that actually works, but apparently some Russian freaks were able to penetrate the Solarwinds update server. So what that means is they were able to get into Solarwinds infrastructure, and how they did that, there's a variety of different reports on that. Apparently they did some social engineering and a few other things to get in, but essentially they got into not just the update server, but their whole, what we call an SDLC pipeline, which is sort of how software is developed. And we're going to talk about that as we go through this article in some very, very light detail. We're just going to skim over a lot of this stuff. But essentially what you're, sorry, I'm just writing here and slightly distracted by something else. So what happened was these hackers were able to infiltrate the SolarWinds network and essentially not just insert malicious code, because that's a lot of times what a hacker will do is they'll insert some malicious code into something. But in today's world, like a lot of software updates and things, they have to be signed by digital certificates. And if you're not familiar with the digital certificate, imagine it just like a signature that you can tell, I know that this digital certificate belongs to Google. This is Google's signature. This is Facebook's signature. This is your signature. This is my signature. So if you were to try and hack or attack, let's say, an organization's like updates, like they're going to get updates from SolarWinds, you want to pack a little piece of malicious code into that and send it to them, they're instantly going to be able to say, no, that's not a digitally, you don't have that certificate, so they can't sign it. And they're like, nah, that doesn't look right, dude. Like, we're rejecting that. Where things get particularly interesting is where they actually got from inside the house. The hackers were able to get into SolarWinds infrastructure and to be able to essentially code their malicious code into an update and digitally sign it, right? So that's where things get a little creepy, because then you have like all of these companies getting updates from the SolarWinds server for this product called Orion. They receive the update, they run the code. Now, whatever that code is on those systems. Now, so we're going to talk a little bit about the compromised DLL file that started this and what it kind of all means. And hopefully this all makes sense to the 1 or 2 or 0 people that are actually watching this. So, long story short, we found all this stuff, blah, 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 blah. Here's something that I really like pointing out is the fact that the compromised file is digitally signed suggests that the attackers were able to access the company's software development or distribution pipeline. It suggests that as early as October, these attackers have been testing their ability to insert code in adding empty classes. What's important about this is these guys didn't just break into the system. They got in. And imagine like a good ninja, they would stay quiet for a couple of days, or they would make sure that they could get in and out without being noticed before they actually did anything, because they don't want anyone to see what they're doing. It's really important that they obfuscate their, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so yeah, that's super concerning. Therefore, the insertion of malicious code into the SolarWinds Orion core business layer likely occurred at an early stage. They just kept writing it low profile. Okay. They attacked, like I said, maintain low profile. They inserted malicious code is super lightweight and only has the task of running. Malware added in parallel threads. This is important. By running it in parallel, they could obfuscate their activities. They could actually spin up different processes and it wouldn't look weird on a system. Someone would be like, oh, that's normal for that to happen. And then once it's loaded, the backdoor goes through extensive list of checks to make sure it's running on an actual enterprise network. This is fucking cool. So obviously, for those of you who do not work in large enterprise IT environments, you have different environments, right? What we call production is what you access on the internet. When you go to Facebook, you're going to the Facebook production website. But there actually exists sub-production instances of Facebook. There's probably tons of them. I don't know what the number is. But essentially, each of those sub-productions are used for things like code development, testing that code, making sure all the integrations work. And there's almost like a recipe to building those codes through all those pre-production layers, right? What's interesting about this hack is that they were able to essentially determined that it was not in a pre-prod environment, that this is a live server. This isn't sitting in some virtual machine. Well, whether it's virtualized or not is a completely different story. But it's not just sitting inside of some test network. This is a production network. So that's kind of crazy. And I mean, that's, again, kind of speaks to the one thing that I think these guys really hammer on hard in this article is that it's an incredibly sophisticated attack. So anyway, we can basically, there's a lengthy number of attacks that they can leverage through here. One thing that you're going to hear a lot of when you hear about, security hacks is the idea of elevate privileges. Okay. So obviously privileges allow you access to a particular system and determine what you can read and write. Whether it's like a Windows or a Unix system, it doesn't matter. It determines, can you access this file? Can you execute this? Can you make this kind of change? Now, a lot of hackers, what they try and do is they try and get in with any privileges. It really doesn't matter if they come in as just a regular user, because sometimes there's certain tips or tricks that these guys can use to make it so that you essentially elevate your privileges from just a regular user to an administrator. A common example of this would be like a penetration tester would walk into an office. He would, go behind someone's, like someone's desk where they didn't lock their computer. He would sit down and he would execute some commands. If that workstation had particular vulnerabilities, like, oh, they didn't patch, they're not on the latest Windows XP patch or whatever, right? He can run some shit, elevate those command privileges to be an administrator, and then start to run higher level commands to essentially just like burrowing your way deeper into the system. So that's one thing that's really important about this, is that the attack allowed them to elevate their privileges to admin level and essentially do whatever they wanted on those remote stations as full administrators, which is, scary, right? Apologies here, guys. Anyway, so blah, 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 blah. We previously got instant remediation stance. So anyway, where it starts, a poisoned code library. So this is the interesting thing. So, the attackers inserted malicious codes into this DLL. It belongs to the Orion platform. They found a suitable place in this DLL component to insert the code. So these guys weren't just sloppy. They didn't just go and say, hey, code up some shit and send it. They're like, we want to do this in a way that if someone was to actually physically look at this code, it's not going to stand out to them, so that it'll get by. Another thing, they would choose a place in the method that gets invoked periodically. So this would ensure both execution and persistence. So they put it in a place to make sure that this thing would get run and it would get rerun. So if for some reason the code stopped, it would get started up again like a lawnmower. Okay. Blah, 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 blah. The modification of this function is very lightweight and could easily be overlooked. That's another thing too. It's not a complicated insertion of code. It's not something that they were like really, that someone would notice if they were looking at it. So why this method was chosen than other ones, a quick look at the architecture of this DLL shows that the refresh internal is part of the class. So this, I don't want to get too much into classes and the different coding terminologies because A, I'm not a coder and I'm not actually equipped to speak to those things really well. And B, I think that's getting a little into the more minutia. What we really need to worry about is the functionality of the backdoor resides entirely in this particular process that it spins up. Okay. Once it's done that, it essentially, has things like backdoors, keyloggers, blah, 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 blah. And then, that's where it actually initiates that stuff in your system. So another thing too is they obfuscated the strings as well. So it didn't look like something that was like, oh, this is suspicious. This says backdoor. This says no. Anyway. Initial reconnaissance. So the initialized method is the fact execution point. It carries out several checks. So again, I spoke to this just a little bit. These checks are where things are like, this is super Russian for starters, and for seconds, it's cunty as hell. So it verifies the process hosting the malicious DLL is named the proper name. So it's making sure the right files are there. It checks that the last right name of the malicious DLL is blah, blah, blah. So it makes sure that this DLL is up to date in case there's a more up-to-date version that it wants it to use. It delays execution by random amounts of time. One of the things that you can do is if you're profiling a system or if you're looking for a particular process that's spinning up, you say, oh, they coded that this starts up at 10 a.m. or whatever, or once every this many hours, by executing in random amounts of time, it obfuscates like what you can see in the system. Verifies the domain name, meets the following conditions. We don't need to get in that too much. It checks out there are no running process related to security-related software. So it actually checks for stuff that might catch it, and if it does, it doesn't run. It checks that there's drivers loaded from secure-related software. Again, same thing. It checks the status of certain services, and then it checks the host blah, 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 and resolves an expected IP address. So the backdoor is this extended validation, blah, blah, blah. The backdoor enters a main execution stage. At its core, the backdoor is a very standard one that receives instructions from the C2 server, that's the control server, and executes those instructions and sends back information. Exactly what a backdoor is. So the idea is it's now executed code. And the way that it's done this is using what was commonly referred to as a buffer overflow. So it uses a vulnerability in computer code, whether it's C or Java or whatever. I'm not too sure what it is in this case, but it uses a vulnerability that essentially allows them to insert bits into the system that they normally shouldn't be able to put them. And the idea is that forces you to run, I can now get it to run this program. I can now get it to give me access to protected memory or whatever that is, right? So it's going to initiate its connection back to its server, basically say, hey, I'm installed, and like all of the shit that you told me to check for is working. It gives you the physical address of the network, the domain name, and the content of the GUID of from the registry. Okay. It also generates pseudo-random URIs. Again, this is just more like obfuscation stuff. More stuff that you won't suspect. Fonts wolf, more random shit that it puts in that makes you, again, obfuscate what it actually is. More stuff in the DLL we don't really need to really look at. And finally, the backdoor component is a JSON document, which adds a unique user ID described earlier and a session ID. What's interesting is this sends this JSON back to the server. So essentially what this is telling you, and it says like, hey, I'm not only installed on this computer, but I'm installed on this specific computer in case you want to call back. So it's like sending essentially like a catalog of like all of the infected machines to the C2 server, so that as all of these back-end systems get infected, they just sit there and watch that list fill up. They're like, there's another one, there's another one, there's another one. So that's one of the ways that it's reporting and cataloging back its activities, right? Once the backdoor access is obtained, the attackers follow the standard playbook of privilege escalation. So we were talking about this before, right? Credential theft, lateral movement, hunting for high-value accounts and assets. Once they are in, they have admin, that's it. It's fucking over, right? Lateral movement was observed via PowerShell remote task creation, detailed in the FireEye and Velocity. So for those of you who are not familiar, Microsoft PowerShell is essentially like DOS on steroids. It allows you to do a lot more of those powerful, command level executions, particularly on servers. So what this is essentially telling us is that it was using PowerShell commands to hack its way through walls, get into other rooms, if you will, of the server. Because in IT infrastructure, particularly in like corporate, IT infrastructure, you build compartments. It's a lot like, security. You hear about compartmentalization of information. We do the same thing, whether it's a logical compartmental of information or physical. We actually don't store some stuff in this data center because we don't even want it to touch any of our other stuff, right? So the idea is that, it's like if you don't have thick walls or it's easy for people to break through those walls, there you go. So that's using PowerShell, not really surprised. Microsoft Defender for endpoint prod. So anyway, the rest of this article speaks a little bit more, I think, if I'm not mistaken, to here is how our product can protect you against this. Which is, great, thanks. But it also tells you how to detect it, like little things you can run to say like, oh shit, is this running on my system, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, that's kind of the architecture of the Solarwinds hack. Now, what are a couple of things that we've learned? We've learned that these guys are pros, right? They're absolutely professionals. They obfuscated all of their steps, and they did so in incredibly clever ways. These are not people who just want to like smash and grab. This was a targeted attack of slowly creeping through the door. It took months for them to do. And really what they were doing is testing the limits of how deep they can get. And what we know about the depth in terms of this hack is it goes every government agency that you do not want this happening in. So that's the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, every other, major American government organization. I'm sure lots of government of Canada, has also been hacked. I can speak from experience that many telco companies in Canada have also been, hit by this, as well as probably every major telecommunications company in the United States uses Orion or uses Solarwinds and is, totally open to this vulnerability, if not completely owned by it. So, okay, so we know that these guys have been hacked. What is the takeaway from this? Well, the major takeaway, guys, is that this did not mean that they could just get into the network and then start executing whatever they wanted on whatever they wanted. They still needed to penetrate certain levels of whether it was like social engineering, credential phishing, using exploits. So if an organization is really, really up to snuff on their updates, on having practicing really good like information security, then it would give you much less of a, how do I put this? It will give you more confidence in like, okay, they might have hacked into our Orion server, but because of the way we architected this, they didn't get into anything else. They weren't able to social engineer anyone. We had two-factor authentication, and also because, we employ, appliance A, B, or C, we detected it and noticed right away. Unfortunately, that's not the case, right? What we're seeing is that the case is actually, no, they fucking own the shit out of like a bunch of these large companies. And, it's concerning. Like it's a really worrying thing. And, some people have been asking me is like, okay, well, how does this affect me? And I say, well, it does and it doesn't. It doesn't affect you as an individual in the sense that, they have your data now, but it affects all of us in the sense that like, well, it's a pretty critical breach. And what is coming out more and more, as we dive a little bit deeper into the rabbit hole, is it's more than one group. It's more than just one group of people who have done this, had this kind of access, executed this exact same kind of attack using this exact same backdoor. But we know that they were really biding their time, and there was more than likely an element of like they were, some of it was targeted like the United States government. But I can only imagine how excited they were to breach like all of these other companies. And, people talk about the potential like intellectual property theft and all that. And sure, that's possible. What I would be more worried about is them, getting their hands on things like really important cryptographic certificates for major companies like banks, like telecommunications companies. There's stuff that's in those networks, and there's certain keys to certain things that would be really, 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 really fucking bad if they got out. And so that's why I think it's important, as people, that we actually make sure that the organizations that, house and, have our data, in their hands are following the proper procedures. Now, I can speak a little bit for telecommunications that, if you're publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange, you have to follow SOX compliance, which is a, it's a pain in the ass, but it's security there for you to make sure that, you're not going to get hacked. And not only that you're not going to get hacked, but you also have, your auditor, and you're not going to be financially corrupt company. There's also PCI compliance. That's the payment card industry, which I have extensive experience with. They also are like, hey, you got to make sure your servers are patched. We expect you to practice these types of like industry standard, IT security or segregation of duties or whatever that might be. So I think we as citizenry need to make sure that like the companies that house our data are holding to these standards. And that we are also being, good stewards of our own data and making sure that we're implementing the right things to keep nefarious people out of our accounts. So that's things like password, having a really good password policy, password compartmentalization, having one password that kind of changes for different applications so that people can't get into everything, and it's not just a small change. It's in your head enough so it's hard to guess or hard to just hash out on a keyboard. Two-factor authentication, cannot speak enough. If you can enable two-factor authentication on account, do it. Don't have any account, even if it's something small. Another thing is I always say, people put in challenge questions to like, oh, I want to reset my password. What city were you born in? What's your cat's name? A lot of this information is publicly available. And so my recommendation to people is that, Do not put answers to those questions that people actually know. Put in the what mythical city do you wish you were born in, or what superpower do you wish you had? Like, it's a cipher in your brain that you have to remember, but by changing and obfuscating that stuff, you make yourself low-hanging fruit. And that brings me to the final point of being safe is you don't want to be low-hanging fruit. That is typically what hackers always go after. When a hacker group steals, a password database from a company, that password database might be hashed, but with a relative, decent amount of like experience, they can probably crack 60% of those passwords just through some very, out there available techniques, things like rainbow tables, brute force, hash matching. There's a whole bunch of things that they can do to just, kind of really, really crack a lot of those weak passwords very quickly. Those are like, imagine it like a hungry squirrel finding a bunch of nuts, right? The squirrel's going to eat the nuts that it can crack easily. The nuts that are harder to crack, that they can't get through at the back, they're just going to give up. They're going to go on to the next nest where there's more fucking soft nuts for them to crack, right? So you want to make sure that you're a hard nut, because a hard nut, yes, they can get in. If they want to get in, they're going to fucking get in. But you really make a hungry squirrel think twice about whether they want to bug you or not. So I think that's where we're going to end today's chat. If there are any interesting questions that come up as a result of this, I'm really excited to talk more about current events, IT security, and fun, stupid stuff like that. So be well, everyone, and I hope everyone has a lovely, lovely evening.